Hi, folks. This is an incredibly special day. Not only is it a professional midday for you guys that you'll actually enjoy. It's not funny. It's not funny. But we have a couple of professional audio dignitaries here, which we don't always get, besides, me. So who we have here is Harvey Goldberg. Sorry. It's the lights. And Harvey, I told him earlier today that he's mixed some of my absolutely favorite music. I mean, stuff that I wasn't, pandering. I truly love I'm an 80s kind of guy, and this music is stuff that I still play on a regular basis and still moves me. And it's stuff that I've used for deconstructions for you guys as well. So it's kind of interesting to have Harvey here. So Harvey did amazing work in England in the 80s. Before that, he was, recorded hits and Grammy Award-winning records for Kool and the Gang. And then he came back to the States after working with Kool. I guess you were also working with jazz greats as well, Dizzy Gillespie. And anyway, the discography is enormous. And then he started working on the Letterman show because they had all these amazing acts, great music, and they needed somebody to mix these things appropriately. So Harvey's going to talk all about that. Now, Harvey will be joined by Don Wershba, who is Senior Vice President of Solid State Logic. For those of you who don't know, Solid State Logic is the premier recording console, live console, broadcast console manufacturer. And I told Don within the first 15 minutes of meeting him on the phone that when we bought our console, Otari called us and called me specifically and asked me for a quote. We were getting ready for an Audio Engineering Society convention. And they said, so why did you buy this Otari console? And I told them we couldn't afford an SSL. And I told them they had pretty lights and they were happy. But it's true that we aspire to own a solid-state logic console here. It's the industry standard. And Don has a long history in the audio world and the production side as well. And I'm sure some of that will come out within these discussions. So come on in. It's okay. Do I have to repeat myself? Is it? No. Presentation. Man. Yeah, come on. Anyway, without further ado, Don Wershba and Harvey Goldberg, please give it up for them.
Well, thank you. I'm Don. That's Harvey. All right. Let me just throw something up here. There we go. That's Harvey's office. There, I think. I guess the lights are on for us. They're washing out. Can everybody see that all right?
Yeah.
Oh, even better. Fabulous. Thank you all for coming. First, I wanted to say a big thank you to Professor Kersner, also to Tommy from the AES. Thank you very, very much. And Dante and Nico, who helped us get all set up. So I'm very, very happy to be here. And we'll spend the next hour or so talking about what Harvey does, what Harvey has done, give you some insights into what it takes to put on a major television show with music every night, sometimes 2 times in the night, and sometimes 2 times, and then something beyond that, because there's a lot that goes on at the Late Show with David Letterman. So I'll start with a little introduction. Obviously, you've heard a lot about Harvey and where he's been. We've known each other since the early 70s. We worked in a New York recording studio together. It's called Media Sound, which was an old Baptist church, which had one of the most beautiful sounding recording rooms. For anything from strings to horns to drums, just sounded amazing in it. And that's where we got to know each other. And our careers have kind of paralleled a bit. Harvey stayed in the production end of things, and I've gone into selling things like that. Now, he's worn a lot of different hats. He's not wearing a hat today, but metaphorically, he's worn a lot of hats, as many of us has. Now, we all started off as shipping clerks, at Media Sound Recording Studio. You had to show that you could be a good shipping clerk before you would be entrusted to touch, back in the day it was a $600 Neumann U87. Today it's a $3,500 Neumann U87. But before you could touch anything to go into the studio, and also, how to behave in a studio, you had to prove that you could be good at the entry-level job. So we were both shipping clerks. I think I was a shipping clerk. We were shipping clerks for about the same amount of time.
Yeah, not at the same time.
No.
Right.
Harvey's a little bit older than us, but not by much. Then you become an assistant engineer, then you become a full-fledged engineer. He's also produced, mixing, engineering, remixing, all of those hats he has worn. Today he's a broadcast music mixer for the Late Show with David Letterman, which you just saw a bunch of clips, and we're going to have some other nice clips as well later on in the presentation. Harvey's going to give us the inside story of a day in the life of mixing the music for the Late Show. And we're also going to see some clips from the show represent the very wide variety of genres. It's been on the air for over 20 years, and it's now reaching its last run. It's the end of May.
May 20th is the last show.
Is the last show. Now, as you heard, how many of you are in the music department here by show of hands? Basically everybody. And those who aren't engineering, you who didn't raise a hand, what department are you in?
I raised my hand.
Sorry?
I did raise my hand.
You did raise your hand. Is there anybody here who's not a music major? And what are you majoring in?
Media production.
Right.
Excellent, excellent. Well, jazz players, per se? Okay. Pop players? Classical players? Aha. Well, we got some good stuff to show you on that as well. Made a list here. Obviously, the connection with Clark Terry was very relevant for the school here as well. And Harvey has worked with Clark Terry, Duke Ellington, Louis Bellson, Sonny Stitt, Elvin Jones, Les McCann, McCoy Tyner, Ron Carter, Stephen Grappelli, Toots Thielman. I guess the list of great jazz players who he hasn't worked with is the shorter list. Dizzy Gillespie, Groove Holmes, and Lonnie Liston Smith, and Pharoah Sanders, and Roy Haynes. So let's get into it. Enough of my yakking, let's boogie. A bit about your background and how you got your start, what motivated you on the career path.
My mom was a singer, so I grew up hearing music being played in our house the entire time, as far back as I could remember. There was always music being played in the house. My mom made sure that I was very aware of music. As I mentioned, she was a singer. But the real big bang for me was I was part of that demographic that all sat down to watch the Ed Sullivan Show the night that the Beatles were on. And I think I was probably around 10 or 11 at the time. And I remember watching that and witnessing something that, aside from the music, of how great the music was, but there was just an energy coming off of the television that I suddenly realized whatever I'm watching here, whatever's going on here, this is what I want to be a part of when I grow up. And it wasn't even defined to me in my own head what that was. I was just witnessing something that I knew that I had to be a part of. And at that point I started, I had already started playing guitar a little bit just prior to that. That obviously put it on the fast path of being dedicated to playing guitar and playing, at that time, rock and roll. I started a couple of junior high school bands, a couple of high school bands. But for me, but there started to become a real fascination for me with my love of music, was not only playing it, but I became an avid record buyer, and I also went to see as much live music as I possibly could. And pretty early in the game, I think when I was around 14, I started becoming very aware that I would buy somebody's record, and the record was great, and then I would go see them live, and it wasn't as good as the record was. And sometimes it was the vice versa. I would go see somebody live, and then run out and get the record, and the record was disappointing compared to what I saw live. And this started to become a huge question mark over my head as to why this was, what was getting lost in the translation, why would it be lost in the translation? If something wasn't that good live, why was it really good as a recording? And I started reading as much as I could about what seemed to me was the magical recording studio. And I also remember reading interviews with various different bands that I had become fans of, as in the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, and they always seemed to be talking about one of the most fun parts for them was working in the recording studio. And so this theme of the recording studio kept coming back, and I began to realize that that's really where I should be, and that's what I have to find out about. Somewhere around that, as I was approaching graduation from high school, maybe a year before, I saw an article in a newspaper that was written by Jack Holtzman. And Jack Holtzman was president of Elektra Records. I don't know if anybody here is aware of Elektra Records, but in the 60s, they were a folk label that slowly gravitated into also being a rock label. So as a folk label, they might have had somebody like Judy Collins, and by the time they translated being a rock label, they had a band like The Doors. And they always had a very, again, being an avid record buyer and studying these records, Elektra Records had a specific sound, as did all the different record companies in those days. Each one of them had an individual sound specific to that company, which is a whole other conversation. But in the article, it was talking about if you're looking for a career and your passion is music, but you don't feel that confident about yourself as a player, which I never did. I was an adequate guitar player at best, but my love of music was as passionate as anybody that was a devoted musician. The article said the place you might want to be, and once again came back the recording studio, which again kept building in my mind as this mystical, magical place to be. At that time, I was living in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I went to the local recording studio there. After informing my parents that that's what I wanted to do, we started looking into schools, and this is in the late 60s now. And at that time, they didn't have programs like what a lot of you were attending here. They really didn't have any. The only recording school that we found out about was a school in Germany for classical recording, and that was pretty much it. And so it seemed, and also from the article that I read, it seemed the way to get into it is that you had to just try to get a job in a recording studio in possibly the shipping mail room that Don described, and then work your way up through what was then an apprenticeship system in those days. I informed my parents of this, who were very nervous about the fact that I was making the announcement that that's what I wanted to do instead of going to college. We went to a local recording studio. Fortunately, the guy that owned the studio said, look, for what you want to do, you don't want to do it here. You really want to go to New York City and get yourself into one of the top studios there where they make real records with successful artists, and that's where you want to go and get your training. And which again made my parents even more nervous. The deal with my parents at that time was they would let me do that for a year, and at the end of the year we would see what this looked like, and then I would be off to college in their mind. Fortunately for me, I was very lucky in that after a couple of months of hitting the pavement in New York, I got a job in what then became one of the top recording studios in New York City. And again, very fortunately, my career just kept going forward. By the end of the year, I was self-supported. And as everybody will tell you, your parents are completely out of the decision-making process once you're self-supported. I've been very, very fortunate to be able to stay in working and recording quality music my entire career.
Which leads on to the
Can
next
I
question.
answer the question?
More so, not only did you answer the question, but you segued perfectly into my next question, which is the studio that both Harvey and I worked at, which was Media Sound on West 57th Street. Now it's a catering hall, I think. But I don't think we knew what a great studio we were entering because we did a lot of jingle work at the very beginning. And it was a very formal business. Media Sound, can you tell us a little bit about that experience in terms of the training and the types of sessions that you found yourself working on and how that helped to form your later career?
Again, I was, as I mentioned, I was very fortunate to get into one of the better studios in New York City. And in an apprenticeship situation, you're being trained by all of the senior engineers at the studio. And there was, I believe there was probably about 5 senior engineers at the studio, each of them specializing in a different style of music. Although in those days it was a little bit more wider. It was wider as far as genre acceptance. As time went by, it became more locked in that you were a rock and roll engineer and only a rock and roll engineer, or you were an R&B engineer and only an R&B engineer. In those days, there was more crossbreeding of the genres. And so you'd eventually work your way up to being an assistant engineer and work with each of these different senior engineers on all the different types of projects that they were doing. The way I got myself in as an assistant engineer is while working in the shipping room, I would stay after my 8 hours of work and offer myself as an assistant to the assistant engineer. And at that point, I was off the books. I was getting paid, but during the day, I'd gotten paid for working in the shipping room. So I was getting an income, and then I would just stay later. And of course, the assistant engineers loved having an assistant that they didn't have to pay for. And then eventually, when a position opened up as an assistant engineer at the studio, I was able to secure that position because I'd already done the training for that.
And again, to remind everyone, because the industry has changed so radically, these were recording studios that had staff engineers, staff assistant engineers, staff shipping clerks. Everyone actually worked for the studio. Later on, I would say probably into the 70s and certainly towards the 80s, we started getting the independent engineer. And quite frankly, Harvey went independent at a certain point where he was getting enough work that they were asking specifically for him, and it wasn't necessarily all going to be in New York City at Media Sound. Sometimes it would be in Scotland, it would be in England, it would be in France, it would be all over the place. But most of the time, if you had the opportunity, you would bring the mixes back to New York, because that was where you
That was my home base.
Yeah, it was the home base. And the studio manager was very encouraging in that regard, because she said, go, spread your wings, go and do all this great work, because I know you'll be coming back when you need to do parts of any of the mixing or the overdubs or whatever, then you'll come back here. But it was a very different business model, quite frankly, whereas pretty much everybody is freelance.
I mean, the thing I want to mention is that because, with the advent of Pro Tools, it's become very simple for people now to have their own recording studio, either in their own house or even their own apartment. So a lot of that's eliminated records needing to be made in in a formal recording studio. What that's also eliminated is the mentoring process that went on during that period. And I can't begin to express how important that mentoring, not only the mentoring period, but even just other people you're working your way up with that are learning things and you're trading information between each other. I can't begin to stress how important that is. As that's disappeared with formal studios becoming less and less available or part of the market anymore. I think that's why something like this, where you are right now, is so important, because what's going on with the programs that they have at various different schools now is in fact replace the mentoring system that you would have had in the recording studio. And I think if people went in straight into recording without growing up in a recording studio or going through a process of what you people are going through right now here, to eliminate that would be more wrong than I can even begin to express.
I mean, at the beginning we talked about the music majors. It seems like the vast majority, almost everyone here, is in the music department, and it seemed to heavily skew toward the classical. How many people, by a show of hands, are either doing engineering or want to do engineering? Not necessarily as a career. So yeah, so is that as a result of it's sort of a necessary requirement in order for you to hear what you're doing, you need to be able to engineer? Now, by show of hands, how many people as players find someone separately who will engineer for you? You're all doing your own engineering. Oh, so a couple here. You'll find some. So yeah, okay, a few more once you understood the question. Yeah, because there's a whole concept of becoming a musician, which is a noble endeavor and a lot of discipline involved in it. And the differences between what an engineer actually does for the musician. So that's very good. Now, I bet a lot of the engineers who you call upon to say, hey, would you do some recording? They're also probably music majors as well. Is that the case? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the whole concept of pure engineering is probably another conversation that we could have some time about that, career and specifically audio engineering. Which brings us to music. One of the things that I've noticed, and Harvey and I talk a lot about, is the very, wide variety sells it short. It's a vast, panorama of different kinds of musical styles that you have been involved in. And you talked about becoming the rock and roll engineer or the jazz engineer or the classical engineer or whatever engineer, but talk a bit to the various kinds of music that you've been involved with and the upsides and if there are any downsides to being that widespread.
Yeah. First of all, I can't even think of any downside as far as the different varieties of music. At the time that I came to New York, I was rock and roll guitar player. In my mind, I was coming to New York to either work with or the next Led Zeppelin, either with or the next Who. When you're working in a recording studio and you're on staff and you're trying to work your way up, you work on projects that become available to you. The first success that I had, and it was really one of the first things I worked on, in those days what they used to do is they'd have what they called the graveyard shift. And the graveyard shift at the studio was record companies would work out a deal for their newer bands that hadn't broken yet to take the later shift in the studio. And in return for that, they would get a lower rate in the studio. Again, because it was the night shift, the senior engineers didn't want to take it, and that was more available for if you were an assistant engineer and you were looking to break in as a senior engineer, you could volunteer to do these later night sessions. The one that I committed to was at that time an unknown band, but it was Kool and the Gang. And Kool and the Gang was really not at all what I had grown up listening to. They were very, now they would be considered a hardcore funk band, especially at that stage. Their two big influences, they were like a post-James Brown band, and they were also big jazz fans. Their two biggest influences was James Brown and John Coltrane. And they were very young. They were roughly the same age as me. And keep in mind, I was 19 when I committed to do this project, and they were roughly the same age as me. And so going in to work on this thing, musically, it was very different than what I had been surrounding myself for with influences. And I had to, what's great about working on things that you don't necessarily listen to all the time is the fact is that when you start working on it, you really have to listen, because none of your preconceived images of arrangement or sounds or proportion necessarily applies to a different genre. And so suddenly, instead of just applying what your template is in your head of that style of music, because it's foreign to you, you have to stop and take the time to learn that music. And it was a great experience for me to suddenly be working. Here I was coming in thinking that music was all about the guitar, and I was now working with a band where the guitar was the least important part of the component, important in the rhythm section, but not the star of the sound. This was a band that was based around bass drums and a horn section. And suddenly it opened up my mind as to how to listen differently. And there was a great combination of where I was coming from and where they were coming from, where we were trading ideas back and forth. Well, I think it's so important. I believe it was Ellington that said, there's only two kinds of music: good music and bad music. And it's so important to open up your mind to all these different styles, especially in the case of myself, where I was becoming a recording engineer and then hoping to eventually go on and become a record producer, of these different styles of music that feature different instruments as the lead instruments, providing you're getting to work with people that are talented enough to play these instruments. You really begin learning about the sounds of different instruments beyond your own preconception of these things. Again, I'm not sure if I answered the question,
I
but
think so. We'll let you guys be the judge of that. Producers and artists, obviously Kool.
yeah. I just want to say one more thing about variety of genres and variety of styles. It's very, very difficult for somebody to do something totally original. And, and I may be saying a dangerous statement here, but I'll go as far to say that I don't think anybody, other than the beginning of time, has ever done anything totally original. Everybody is always building off of somebody else. But what you can be original about is the way you put together combinations of different things that you've heard in your lifetime. And you can put those things together in a way that's never been put together before. And that can make you look original.
I think there's a theory that says to be successful, you either have to be first, best, or different. And I suppose you can combine those two as well. Are there any other notable, memorable sessions, artists, and/or producers? Because you've worked with, great producers. Bob Thiel comes to mind, who started the Impulse label. So we got a head nodding there because you know it's on there. Whether in jazz, rock.
Well, again, all of these things, everything. It's so important to stay open-minded, not only about music, but just everything that comes across in your life, because everything, if you're open-minded about it and you accept it and you allow these things to come into your life, everything does lead to something else. And as I mentioned, I went to New York thinking I was going to be working with something like Led Zeppelin and The Who, my first big success. And I should mention that album that I worked on wound up with 3 top 10 singles from it. And I went on to make 4 albums with the band. And skyrocketed my career almost overnight. I think even today, 3 hit singles off of one album still means a lot. And suddenly I was working with, a few other R&B things, but also at that time there was a producer, a very famous producer by the name of Bob Thiel that Don had mentioned, And Bob Thiel was very famous as a jazz producer. He founded the Impulse label. He's the one who discovered and signed John Coltrane. His track record was a veritable who's who of everybody in jazz, everybody from Louis Armstrong to Coltrane, it was all over the map. He had been working with a jazz act by the name of Lonnie Liston Smith, who was a Fender Rhodes player that was experimenting with jazz improvisation, but a rhythm section that you could dance to. And so Lonnie had become a fan of the Kool and the Gang records and told Bob, you should go look this guy up. So Bob came in and I started working with Bob on the Lonnie Liston Smith records, which again wasn't where I thought I was going to be. I still thought I was going to be working with the next Led Zeppelin, but through Bob, aside from this Lonnie record, Bob then started bringing more of his traditional jazz stuff, and that was the whole list that Don read earlier, people like Clark Terry and Sonny Stitt and Elvin Jones. And again, I had been aware of jazz, but it wasn't part of my DNA of what I was growing up and listening to as a teenager. And suddenly working on these records became something I was doing on a regular basis that was now opening my mind again. And, you will never learn more about recording piano than if you're recording somebody like McCoy Tyner. These are you'll never learn more about recording drums more than if you're recording somebody like Elvin Jones. And these are guys that were so good and so stylistic in what they were doing as a sound that, again, for me to have a preconceived image of what drums should sound like, Elvin Jones had a bigger statement. It's not only what drums sounded like, but what Elvin Jones sounded like. McCoy Tyner had a bigger statement of what a piano should sound like. It's what McCoy Tyner sounded like. And these guys were really, I don't want to say brutal, but they were brutal on me if they came into a playback and they didn't just hear piano, they needed to hear their sound coming across the speakers. And it was great to work with these guys and have to learn how to do that. And it's very funny, it's not really until after I did all of those kind of things that I finally got around to starting to do some rock and roll records. And when I started working with rock and roll, I was working with people like Keith Richards and Peter Frampton and Mick Ronson and at those times legendary rock guitar players. And one of the things that they loved as they were working with me is that I understood how to get a great rhythm section sound, which everybody that they had been working with in the rock world got great rock guitar sounds, which I was able to do because of my appreciation of rock guitar. But I was now bringing something to their records that they weren't getting from other people. And it was all this other background that I wound up almost by accident having gone through all that process. But in hindsight, that's education.
And sometimes the road not taken is the one that teaches you the most.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my whole career just always went like that. As long as you stay open-minded, one thing just keeps leading to the next thing. And you never know who's a fan of a different style of music that you're not aware they're a fan of that. So you might think there's a direct path to a certain artist that you're trying to work with, when in fact it's a very different path than you thought it would be, because they happen in their off hours listen to different kinds of things that they discover you in that. And it's just I can't stress how open-minded you have to be about everything.
Listening to everything, it can't hurt. Which leads into the next question. Earlier you talked about hearing the difference, sometimes one way, sometimes the other, of live versus studio recording. And with what you do today, it's fundamentally live recording every night. And you've done hundreds of records in the studio. So talking a bit about what you noticed and how you developed your approach to engineering and producing with that live versus studio.
Right. And again, this whole thing that one thing always keeps leading to another thing. The fact that I had worked on such a great variety of music, if you jump ahead 20 years after the start of my career to when I joined The Late Show with David Letterman, I mean, there was a situation where the music on that show is insanely dramatic. I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say that my week can start with U2 on Monday, it could be Dolly Parton on Tuesday, it could be the Metropolitan Opera on Wednesday, and it could be Jay-Z on Thursday. And I'm not exaggerating that as a work week. And so once again, this whole idea of understanding all the different varieties and the different genres, once again, paid off enormously. But then there was another twist in this, in that I had grown up from an audio standpoint in recording studios. And recording studios are very controlled environments. There's also a whole other field of audio, which is the live audio scene, which I did not grow up in. And my job at the Letterman Show is a strange kind of hybrid. It's mixing that's meant to be heard similar to a record, and in the respect that I say similar to a record, when I started off mixing and recording records, the main goal at the end of it all is, what will this sound like on the radio? And television isn't that different. And by that, when you're a record mixer, you're not only mixing for it to sound good in the environment that you're listening to, but even more so, you're learning how to make something that will translate into many, many different environments. It's something that has to, you can't control what kind of stereo somebody's listening to, how they've had it set up in their home, whether the acoustics being played in is good or not. But you do learn how to make something that will translate the energy and the overall sound of that record in all of those different environments. And that's something that is something that you learn over a period of time. And again, I was lucky in the respect that most of the things that I worked on, of the different styles of music, whether it be R&B or rock or pop, I was lucky that those things went on to become successful records, because it allowed me to be able to hear those records in different environments. I mean, without that success, the only thing I can suggest to somebody is that when you do a mix for yourself, visit every friend you've got and play it on their stereo at each of their houses and each of their apartments, because you need to hear it in different places. When you've had something that's been successful on the radio, you're lucky enough that you could walk into a shoe store and you'll hear it playing in the background. You get in the car and turn on the radio and it'll be in your car or somebody else's car. So I was very lucky to hear that. Now, that being said, somebody who mixes live, and by live I don't mean for broadcast, live for a concert venue or an auditorium, is very literal in their mixing. And excuse me if I get a little boring here, because it's a little bit more technical. But somebody that's mixing live is very literal to the environment. The audience that's listening to that mix, including the mixer, will never hear that mix anywhere else other than those literal speakers that they're being heard on at the moment, in the exact same environment. It'll never be heard in another environment other than that exact environment. And the job of a live mixer at a live event is to use those speakers in that environment to the utmost to create the best possible sound he can for that particular point of time in that environment and those speakers for that particular audience. The broadcast mixer, on the other hand, is again mixing more like mixing for radio. You're mixing something that needs to be heard in other places, so it's more like recording studio. recording studio, you have a great deal of control in how you can record these things. There's a great variety of mics you can choose, a great variety of placement, of mic placement. So you can get, it's easier to create something that will work in other places than it is if you're just lining up musicians all on top of each other, set up in a way that necessarily is not necessarily the best choice for sound. Going to the show, because they were all live performances, it was a learning curve to how do I get this to sound like a record when I'm not recording it like you would a record. And in the process, there's something I learned that I wish I had known in the years that I was in a recording studio. And that's that live, there is an energy that happens live that when it goes well is, for lack of a better word, magic. It's something that happens that's it's not tangible per se, but it exists and it's exciting and it is there, and that will make up for some of the sound deficiencies that you can't get quite perfect. That'll fill it in. In fact, I even began to think that one of the things that people are actually chasing in the studio when they're chasing after perfection, they might not actually be chasing after perfection. They might be chasing after this X factor that happens live, that doesn't happen in the studio. And in hindsight, going back, there's quite a few records that I wish we had spent more time chasing after, trying to create something really exciting in the studio and not being so obsessed whether it's the exact perfect miking of the guitar or the exact perfect reverb. It's great to get a combination of the two of those things, but that was like a real eye-opener for me. And so that starts to become part of the mix too. Once you recognize that, you want to get that, for lack of a better word, magic, you want to capture that other people can hear also. Did that in?
Yes.
Okay.
Before we get on to some clips from the show, which kind of punctuate all that we've been talking about, I want to get in a little bit of the nuts and bolts of a day at the office for Harvey and the Late Show. Now, the first thing to remember is, while that is a very impressive piece of hardware up there, it is actually one of 5 different rooms, operators, equipment that are utilized. You've got the music room, obviously, but you're even doing more than music. You're tracking production elements as well.
No, just music.
Just goes up there. Was there a time where you were also pulling some production elements as well? Okay.
No.
So just music at the music room. That's easy enough. Next door to you is the sound effects room, which not often used, but occasionally.
It's used quite a bit in various different comedy bits and stuff. And the classic example, I don't know if any of you have ever seen the show, but and Dave hasn't done it in a long time, but Dave used to have this habit of throwing his pencil at the glass behind him, and the glass would crash. Obviously, that's generated from the sound effects room.
Yeah. Then you've got, we'll get to the production at the end of it, you've got a full house PA system for the audience. You've also got monitors for the musicians, both the house band and the guest band.
Right.
So that's another 2 positions of audio, so we're up to 4 so far.
Right.
And then the final mixing component of it, what actually goes to air, what gets recorded, is the production audio room, which takes a feed from Harvey, takes a feed from sound effects, does not take a feed from the monitors at the front of house. But you've actually got 5 different rooms.
And the production mix is mixing all dialogue, and every time they roll a videotape, audio that's coming from the videotape. And that's what puts it all together into being a show, a television show.
So let's talk about a typical nuts and bolts setup for you in the music room. Run us through your day.
Yeah, I usually, a couple of days before the act comes in, I usually get an input list of what their touring input list looks like. And then we have to get back to them and remind them that they're not doing the entire concert today, that we really only need a song-specific input list. Once that comes in, then I think about, the kind of mics that I want to use, because again, the mics that they use on the road goes back to being what I described as what the front of house live mixer is doing. He's trying to create the perfect sound for that particular environment. I'm trying to create a sound that'll work on a gazillion different kinds of television sets with a gazillion different speakers, with some people having the television hooked into their stereo, some people not. So I quite often go with a different mic choice than what a front of house mixer would use. So looking through their list, I then translate that into the microphones that I need to use to make it work for me. We then put together a setup. Our stage is much smaller than the average concert stage, so the setup has to be configured to work in our stage. I get there in the morning as the band is loading in, because without fail, whatever input list I was sent is wrong. And then we have to rethink the way that we planned it out. Any questions that come up, I need to be there for. And it's also where music is very different within the course of the day of the production compared to the other elements of the show, is music is the only one where you're actually interfacing with yet a separate production company that's not part of the show. And each of these bands have their own touring production company that takes care of their things. And not all production companies are created equal, is the only way I can say it. The more successful bands have a better, more solid crew. The bands that aren't successful yet don't. And so there's a lot that we have to go through and test out just to cover for the fact that these people may not have their act together. There's sort of three stages of crews for bands. One is in the very beginning, they usually have their friends as their crew because their friends will do it for free or for practically nothing. Then the band starts to become successful, and but they don't want to then turn around and become cold that now that they're successful, they're going to turn around and let go of their friends who devoted working for free for them for many, many years. Now, granted, as a band, some bands become better at what they do as they become successful, some don't. The same is with the crew. And the third stage of the band is when they're successful and they realize who of their crew, of their production crew, stays on with them and who they finally have to let go. And we deal with all those different permutations on a daily basis. So after that, we would then do a line check, and a line check is basically making sure that my crew plug the instruments, plug the microphones in properly, that all of our gear is working properly, and making sure that all of the band, the artist's gear is working properly. Once we've gone through all of that and make sure that all works, and that's roughly a 3-hour process, from the load-in, from them to set up, to get it all plugged in, to checking out our stuff, to checking out their stuff. That's a good 3 hours right there. Once we know all of that works, we then do what's called camera blocking or music rehearsal. And at that point, we're actually rehearsing the song that they're going to perform on the show, while the cameras are rehearsing their camera shots for it. And I usually get anywhere from I would say 3 to 5. 5 would be maximum. 3 would be what it normally is, run-throughs of the song. When I come in the morning, I listen to the record of the band, so I get an idea of what the arrangement, at least on the record, was, what they generally envision themselves to sound like. Of course, it's going to be different live, but it points me in the right direction. And I get, I would say, roughly half an hour, 20 minutes to half an hour to put together a mix of that particular song that will be performed on the show later. So that's, so we're talking total is anywhere from 3.5 to 4 hour process for this one song. Then on any television show such as this one, music is not the only thing in the show. So you have to share the stage with other elements of the show that are taking place. So we tend to do our stuff do all these things in the morning. Once we get the music out of the way, then they carry on with the rest of the show. And later in the afternoon, we have a house band on the show, which is Paul Schaefer and his band. Later in the afternoon, I'll rehearse, I'm going to say, for about 20 minutes with Paul's band. Paul is playing different music for different guests, what they call play-on music. If they introduce, whatever actor is coming out, the band will play some sort of song that relates to whoever that actor is. If it's a sports star coming out, the band will play some sort of song relating to that. So we do that rehearsal in the afternoon. That's roughly a 20-minute rehearsal. And then we go and then from 4:30 to 5:30, we do the show as a live show. And what's interesting for us is we never actually rehearse the show in order. We do all these things as separate elements. And the first time we really sing it all at the same time in order is actually when we're doing the show.
Yeah, having spent a fair bit of time down in the music room and watching Harvey and work and then watching the show, it's very, very fast-paced. Also, it's television, so there's a lot of money on the table when it's going on, so everybody really does have to do their bit and do it very, very efficiently.
And again, I want to backtrack to something, again, about why working on different styles of music pays off. Is again, as I mentioned, we get all these different styles on the show. And fortunately, because in my recording career, I got to work on all those different styles, I pretty much understand the sounds that are needed for those different styles. However, the speed in which this is done comes back to the period that I had worked on jazz records. As I mentioned earlier, as a teenager, I wasn't really aware that much of jazz and got my education on it through Bob Thiel. But the thing about recording jazz is those guys never play the same thing twice. And when they walk into the room and start to play, you better have the red light on. They don't want to hear that you don't have the mic placement just right yet, and can I hear you play a little bit more, or can I hear that again? In jazz, there is no such thing as again. So the period that I went through, the jazz period, is really where I built my speed. And so if you jump ahead many years later, and then after jazz, I went back to working on pop records and working on rock records and all that, and kept perfecting those sounds. But when you jump ahead to me now joining the show again, getting involved in the Letterman show, it was now suddenly a combination of having to do all these, knowing how to do these different genres, and being able to do it at a speed that would never, it's a speed that would be considered a junk in a recording studio. It's just way too fast for any recording studio to ever get their mind around that. But it's the fact that I had some training in certain things that required speed that enabled me to apply it to, again, of all these different genres.
Well, it's time for proof of concept now. Everybody take a little seventh inning stretch. I'm going to swap over here, and we're going to see the end results.
Yeah, I just threw together, I wanted to throw together just a short compilation that shows even a bigger variety of styles that have gone through the show than what you saw in the loading when you first came in. I think you get an idea of what I was talking about, variety there.
And there's a great story behind the last piece there that I was not aware of.
Oh, that was after Johnny Carson died. That was actually Dave did a memorial show, a whole show dedicated to Johnny Carson. Doc Severinsen, Tommy Newsom, and Ed Shaughnessy were in the Tonight Show band, and that was in fact Johnny Carson's favorite song.
How are we doing on time? It's 10:02. I think we could go straight into Q&A, so we give you all a chance to ask Harvey any questions that might have come to mind, maybe about some of the things that you just saw, or just any other things that are of interest to you. Everyone right there. Speak up.
You were talking about the jazz days. What were some of the techniques that it taught you, for speed?
Oh, well, as I mentioned, the jazz guys would come in. Normally for a rock band, you would come, you would spend some time getting a drum sound, you'd spend time getting guitar sounds, you'd play around with some miking techniques, people would work on their headphone mixes. Jazz guys would come in, and as soon as they could find their seat, they were ready to record. And that, to me, was a real, it was a shock to my system the first time I went through it. And you just learn to get yourself ready to go much faster than you would with any other style of music. The jazz players were so specific about their own sound. They usually wanted as little processing as possible because they felt everything else was getting in the way of their own sound. So you learn to be very pure, very quick. I hope that answers it.
I mean, anecdotally, I remember, because I assisted Harvey a lot. I think I probably assisted Harvey longer than I needed to assist Harvey. It was just such an enjoyable experience. And just, to be in the room and, just to learn that. And I remember very early on I said something akin to, well, we're going to work on the sound until we get it right and then they'll start playing. And he just shook his head. He said, no, it's the other way around. When they're ready to play, you're ready to record. And there are any number of different ways of making art, whether it be musical art or graphic art or film art or whatever, and they're not all the same. And I think it's knowing when you walk into an environment that when they come in, they're ready to play. Well, then you have to be that person. And then there's, the Trevor Horn style of I'm going to spend 6 months making a single. Well, that's another way of making art. And, maintaining your frame of reference over that long period of time can be the great challenge. So it's just kind of sizing it up and going, okay, this is how we have to work today, and doing it quickly. Somebody else had it.
Every record requires a different approach. And it's funny, I remember there was a point in my life when I would finish an album and I'd figure, okay, I finally figured out the right way to do this. And then I'd start another album and none of those rules would apply for the next album. It's so specific to the group of people in the room. Making records, television, movies and records are a collaborative art form. That's starting to disappear in records, which I think is a shame, which is why you guys should really enjoy what you're going through right now, because what's been happening in the record business is becoming less of a collaborative art form and becoming more just one person's vision. But you have to tailor what you're doing to never get in the way of the music.
I was just wondering, when you're mixing on The Late Show, how much autonomy do you have? And in other words, how often does the record label or the band have somebody with you that's kind of chiming in on what they...
Actually, a lot less than you would think. Actually, very little. I would say 50% of the time, nobody is with me. And then, another 45% of the time, the front of house mixer is with me, but he doesn't really get involved because it's not a front of house mix type of style. They're usually there, and they can be quite helpful, those guys, because again, speed is of the essence here. And And if the backing, for instance, if there's 3 backing vocalists, and one of the backing vocalists doesn't sing until the last chorus, I need to know that. Otherwise, I'm going to spend the whole mix keep soloing the backing vocals. Is the guy singing? Is he not singing? Instead of working on the mix, because I have very limited time to get this mix together. It helps me enormously to turn to the front of house mixer and say, when the hell does the bass player sing? And they'll say, oh, he doesn't sing until the last line. And then I know. So that kind of thing helps to have the guy there. And, you know, fortunately, the show has developed a really good reputation for doing this well. And the front of the house guys always come in and say, well, this is like my day off. This is great. And they're really there to help me with some cues that would just speed up the whole process. Occasionally, the record producer shows up, and that's very rarely. And that might be a problem, because some record producers come in and realize that this is not their record. This is not the record. There'll be a record producer that comes in and expects this thing to sound like his record that he spent months working on. And this is a band now that he's not able to slip it and cut and paste it. They're playing it live. There isn't the luxury of what he was doing, and it's not going to sound like his record. This has to sound like a really good recording of what they're doing at that particular time. Fortunately, I run into that maybe once a year at the most. You know, the record companies sometimes come down and hang out and listen in my room. The managers might be there, but again, they're not really, you know.